You can see that we are now entering into the Common Era. You might notice in your modules, the module for this week, that there is a video that's kind of a breakdown of the history of Rome. It might be good if you watched that before this video, because you might not be as lost when I'm discussing things. Like if I talk about Julius Caesar or Augustus Caesar or something, you might be able to put them in context. So watch that National Geographic video, come back, or watch it after, your choice, but it will help you understand what I'm talking about better. These are some of the highlights of what we'll be looking at today. Okay, just a brief rundown. So the Romans overthrew the Etruscans, and then they formed a republic with the center in Rome. The Etruscans themselves were absorbed by the Roman Republic at the end of the 3rd century BCE, by which time Rome had steadily expanded its territory in many directions. Roman culture borrowed heavily from Greece. They adopted Greek gods and heroes and gave them Latin names. During the Republic, Roman art was rooted in its Etruscan heritage, but territorial expansion brought wider exposure to the arts of other cultures. The Romans used Greek designs and Greek orders in their architecture, they imported Greek art, and they employed Greek artists. In order to worship those gods and govern over their newly conquered territories, they needed temples and buildings, and in those buildings they created a variety of ways to use the arch. The round arch was not an Etruscan or Roman invention, but the Etruscans and Romans were the first to make widespread use of it. Round arches displace most of the weight, or downward thrust, along the curving sides, and they transmit that weight to adjacent supporting uprights. This very impressive building is known as the Fortuna Primogenia, and it was built after 82 BCE, and even though that's in the time of the Republic, at some points in the Republic there was a dictator or a tyrannical dictator, and so this was built by Sulla, who was Rome's first dictator. And it had this very disciplined design that was set on 7 terraces. It was very symmetrical. This big complex had an oracle like Delphi. There were big spaces in the architecture, and they used concrete to achieve this. There was this idea of classical symmetry and balance, but with lots of complexity. And one of the things that I love about this, and how it relates to other things in this class, is that the entire hillside becomes architecture, kind of like the Temple of Hatshepsut. Like the Etruscans, the Romans built urban temples in commercial centers. This temple is dedicated to the god Portunus, who was the god of keys, doors, and livestock. And the site overlooked the Port Tiberinus at a sharp bend in the river, and from here, Portunus, the god, watched over the cattle barges as they entered the city. The actual design of this is kind of a hybrid of Etruscan and Greek architecture. The columns of the portico, or the front porch, are freestanding, while the remaining 5 columns on the long sides and the 4 columns at the rear are half columns engaged along the walls of the cella. This form is sometimes called pseudo-peripteral, as distinct from true peripteral temples like the Parthenon, which is entirely surrounded by freestanding columns. And you can also see that the steps are only in the front, which make it more frontal or formal. Unlike Greek temples, Roman temples are all about interior space, which the visitors are actually invited to enter through one opening along the longitudinal axis of a symmetrical plan. The Maison Carre, which means square house, is a textbook example of a Roman temple. It's raised on a high podium. The temple dominated the forum of the Roman city of Nîmes, and side note, the word denim comes from serge de Nîmes, which is a type of twill fabric that was exported from this town. Anyway, the building is a rectangle almost twice as long as it is wide. The facade is dominated by a deep portico, almost a third of the building's length. In that portico, you have a hexastyle design with 6 Corinthian columns under the pediment. It's also pseudo-peripteral, with 20 engaged columns embedded along the walls of the cella. And then a large door leads to the small and windowless interior where the shrine was originally housed. So if you've ever been to any kind of government building, you might have seen these little details in the architecture and thought, oh, that's just a nice design or whatever, but they all sort of mean something. And I want to talk about the egg and dart decoration that divides the architrave from the frieze. This is by no means original to the Maison Carre. It's just that it is a repeated motif that you see in many classical buildings, and nobody asks why usually. So we're going to ask why today. The egg and dart pattern is characterized by a repetition of oval shapes like an egg split lengthwise, with various non-curved patterns like darts repeated between the egg pattern. The earliest examples of egg and dart molding were found in ancient Greek architecture. It's comprised of an egg, which represents the shield, and a dart for the spear. Or some historians contend that this ornamental device is supposed to represent the duality of life, the egg, or the beginning, and the arrow or dart, or death. Okay, so let's move on from architecture to sculpture, and we will look at portrait sculpture specifically. Roman Republican portraiture is frequently associated with the notion of verism, or an interest in the faithful reproduction of the immediate visual and tactile appearance of subjects. This is a tradition of commemorating famous men who were involved in the foundation of the Republic. Portrait sculptors of the Republic sought to create lifelike images. Instead of generalizing a human's face, smoothing out its imperfections, they wanted to embody the wisdom and experience that comes with old age. Verism can be defined as a sort of hyperrealism in sculpture, where the naturally occurring features of the subject are exaggerated, often to the point of absurdity. In the case of Roman Republican portraiture, middle-aged males adopt veristic tendencies in their portraiture to such an extent that they appear to be extremely aged and careworn. This stylistic tendency is influenced by the tradition of a deep-seated respect for family tradition and ancestry. For late Republican politicians without any famous ancestors, and this was a group famously known as New Men, the need was even more acute, and verism kind of rode to the rescue. The adoption of such an austere and wizened visage was a tactic to lend familial gravitas to families who had none, and thus hopefully increase the chances of the aristocrat's success in both politics and business. I feel like there's a connection between the engaged columns, that pseudo-peripteral idea, and the idea of exaggerating your age. And I might put that question to you because there is a connection between the idea that you're being true, but also there's some falseness to this as well. Part of family respect and Roman values was a type of ancestor worship. Death masks often were created and venerated. Portrait busts were an artistic step up from this kind of creepy death mask idea. And here's how it worked. A likeness, typically in wax or plaster, of a person's face after their death, usually it would be made by taking a cast or impression from the corpse. Death masks may be memento mori, or mementos of the dead, or they can be used for creation of portraits. It's sometimes possible to identify portraits that have been painted from death masks because of the characteristic slight distortions of the features caused by the weight of the plaster during the making of the mold onto the face of the corpse. These were essentially death masks of notable ancestors that were kept and displayed by the family. In the case of aristocratic families, these wax masks were used at subsequent funerals so that an actor might portray the deceased ancestor in a sort of familial parade. Portraits in this subject's hands document his upper-class lineage. This life-size bronze sculpture is important for a number of reasons, but I want to name two. First, it shows the hold that the Etruscans still had on the Romans. So part of talking about the Etruscans was how they were bronze workers, and so there's still this Etruscan tradition in Roman art. Second, this is known as the Orator, and it's depicting a man addressing a gathering. It might have been on display in like a public square to show the officials' gratefulness for the benefactions of this man. And that story is important, but that's not the part of the story that I like, which is it is a predecessor to this very famous sculpture. This sculpture of Augustus, who was the first emperor of Rome, even though he never really called himself emperor, was found in 1863, 9 miles away from Rome, in the suburb of Prima Porta, which is why it's called the Augusta of Prima Porta. You can see that there are two examples of this sculpture, one that's painted and one that is not. Now, when it was found in 1863, it's possible that it had paint on it, but there was a theory in art history at the time that marble statues were only beautiful if they were pure. They actually didn't think that sculptures had paint on them, or at least they didn't want to acknowledge that idea. And so I'm showing you these two things because I want you to know that this would have been brightly painted, and the sculpture that we have now is free of paint. And it might have actually had the paint removed at the time to help prove the art historian's point of purity in the marble. Okay, so the original statue of Augustus was probably made around 20 CE. The central focus of the statue's breastplate depicts a Roman soldier receiving the standards from a Parthian. The viewer is reminded of Augustus's unparalleled achievement of his victory over the Parthians. Roman artists of the Augustan age created a new style. It's a Roman form of idealism that's heavily influenced by a revival of Greek classical ideals. In this work, we see the emperor as he wanted to be seen and remembered, not, as we just discussed in the Roman Republic, looking as if he led a long, difficult life. The detail is naturalistic enough to be recognizable as Augustus, but his portraiture was also political propaganda. The sculptor added mythological and historical imagery that exalts Augustus's family and celebrates his achievements. His hand position is that of an orator, like the one we just looked at. His head looks young, even though he was about 40 when the work was commissioned. And the support for the statue is a Cupid riding a dolphin, and both were attributes that were associated with Venus, emphasizing his divine lineage. This monument, known as the Arapakis, commemorated Augustus's triumphal return to Rome after he established rule in Gaul, which is basically modern-day France and Belgium. It consists of a walled rectangular enclosure surrounding an open-air altar made entirely of marble panels carved with elaborate sculpture. This monument is a powerful piece of propaganda. It unites portraiture and allegory, religion and politics, the private and the public. The choice to celebrate peace and prosperity breaks with the tradition of triumphal monuments that advertise success in war and victory on the battlefield. By championing peace, at least in the form of public monuments, Augustus promoted a powerful and effective campaign of political message making. This monument, in its simplest form, is an open-air altar for blood sacrifice associated with the Roman state religion. The ritual slaughtering and offering of animals in Roman religion was routine, and such rites usually took place outdoors. The placement of the Arapakis in the Field of Mars, along the Via Lata, now known as the Via del Corso, situated it closely to other key Augustan monuments, like this giant sundial known as the Orlogium Augustae, which, interestingly, would cast a shadow over the Arapakis on the day of Augustus's birthday, and the mausoleum of Augustus. So it was like a whole complex of monuments to Augustus. The altar itself sits within a monumental stone screen that has been elaborated with bas or low relief sculpture, the panels combining to form a semi-mythological story about Augustus and his administration, as well as Rome's deep roots. So it served a purpose of reinforcing Augustus's place in Rome and Rome's place in the world. The altar enclosure is roughly square, while the altar itself sits atop a raised podium that is accessible via a narrow stairway, similar to the temples that we've looked at so far. The altar was the functional portion of the monument. It was the place where the blood sacrifice or the burnt offerings would be presented to the gods. Processional scenes occupy the north and south sides of the altar screen, and what is depicted seems to be a celebration of the peace, or the pax, that Augustus had restored to the Roman Empire. This altar was actually discovered during the time of Mussolini, and there's been a good deal of modern restoration, especially on the north wall with many heads restored or replaced. The south wall of the exterior screen depicts Augustus and his immediate family. The identification of the individual figures has been the source of a lot of debate. Depicted here are Augustus and Marcus Agrippa, who was his friend and son-in-law and lieutenant. He appears hooded, along with other members of the imperial house. All those present are dressed in ceremonial garb, appropriate for the state sacrifice. The presence of state priests, known as flamines, further indicate the solemnity of the occasion. So let's finish with the Gemma Augustusea. It's a large onyx cameo, which basically means a gemstone carved in low relief. It glorifies Augustus as triumphant over barbarians and as the deified emperor. So we've seen this in other cultures, where the leader becomes a god. Unlike art in the public sphere, private art would not have been seen by a large audience. Only a select few would have been granted access if you were lucky enough to be invited to a dinner party at the emperor's palace. He might display his gem collection to show off his large imperial cameos, but the fact that it was private and it wouldn't have been seen by the majority of Roman citizens didn't mean that it didn't have the same function as the public monuments. So if you were at a dinner party with Augustus and he showed you a large cameo, that cameo would have advertised his military victories as well as his role of bringer of peace and his connection to the gods. As for what we're actually looking at, the upper and lower scenes take place at different times and are basically a cause and effect. The lower scene takes place at the northern frontiers just after the battle won by the Romans. The upper scene connects Rome to other past great empires of the world. And here we see Augustus sitting below his birth sign, while the eagle that personifies him as Jupiter sits below. You can see that as a symbol of ending many years of internal strife for Rome, he is presented with the oak crown. In his right hand, he holds this stick known as a latus. It's an augury stick in which he reads the signs of the gods through the flight patterns of birds. And then he declares that his wars are just. He faces Roma, which represents all he united and saved from civil bloodshed, and he is equal to Roma. His feet lay upon armor, which could be identified with the newly conquered barbarians. This grouping basically shows the pacification of the Roman world, which results in prosperity, fertility, and hopefully for Rome, a long-lasting peace. All right, you made it through a long one. There's only a few weeks left. We can do it!